Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week, we review the 1962 Sino-Indian War in the light of fresh academic perspectives. Perspectives based on archival material that has become available to the researcher over the last decade plus. India was surprised in October 1962 when China demonstrated its military superiority and then Prime Minister Nehru's ill-conceived forward policy lay in tatters. This was a limited war, and China, having quote-unquote taught India a lesson, withdrew its troops unilaterally on November 20th, a month later. However, the political and strategic impact of this war on the bilateral relationship has been considerable. And 54 years later, it sets the frame of reference for Delhi and Beijing in their perception of each other, even as the territorial and border dispute that triggered the war remains unresolved. The narrative of this war is very firmly entrenched in the collective memory of both nations, and its contours have become inflexible. Both India and China have their own versions of the quote-unquote perfidy of the other, and consequently, the bilateral relationship remains uneasy and stunted. Can the 1962 war be revisited to make the narrative more malleable, to consider fresh perspectives about the context and the drivers that encouraged the two principal leaders, Prime Minister Nehru and Chairman Mao, to act in the manner that they did? To discuss this issue, we have an eminent panel. Allow me to introduce and welcome Dr. Amit Dasgupta, who has just co-edited a book on the 1962 war, Professor Madhavan Palak, who is now the editor of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru, and Ambassador Kishan Rana, a diplomat and author of rare acumen. Welcome, gentlemen. Let me turn to you first, Dr. Dasgupta. You have co-edited this book on 1962 and the title is Fresh Perspectives. So perhaps you could help our viewers to understand what are the fresh perspectives that you have brought into the public domain 54 years later?
Well, it started with the consideration that there is quite a bit of literature on the war, but there is quite a bit opinionated literature, like you all know Neville's books.
Neville Maxwell's book, yeah.
Right. India's China War.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of strong sentiment in India. And we found now that, as you said, archival material is available. It is time to produce chapters based mostly on these new archival materials. And it is not that the whole story is rewritten, of course, but we have got some new insights, and I would dare say so, especially on the Indian side. The internal story is written thanks to the diaries of the then Foreign Secretary, and materials that have become available, which we see in the selected works of Nehru, in the National Archives, in Tinmurti. And there's also archival research done in Yugoslavia, Egypt, which helps us understanding the non-aligned involvement after the war, and so on. So I think we don't tell a new story, but we've given many more insights, and I assume also because we belong to another generation that...
So can I request you to tell us what are the one or two main fresh perspectives that you as an academic, as a researcher, have now identified?
From my own point, that's my chapter and that's my research on the Foreign Secretary Shubi Maldat. And there is a very detailed story about, for example, Krishna Menon being kept out for full 2 years out of the boundary dispute from early 58 to the summit in 1960. And that's a decision by Nehru, who said that Krishna Menon was biased and he wanted to have other people in charge. And that is Dutt, that is Jagadas Mehta, Sarvepalli Gopal, so all well-known diplomats or historians. That is there. We learn about the formation of a strategy with the Indian government, which is the only strategy that ever existed. Because thereafter, there's not much. As you said, the forward policy is a gamble. And so this is a new perspective. For me, there was something new was the strong involvement of the non-alignment after the war.
In the entire 62.
Yes.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that. Professor Palak, you have seen the book and you have your own appreciation. So what would you say are some of the elements of the fresh perspectives and how do they help us now?
I think to add to what Amit Dasgupta has just said, the role of Subimal Dutt is of considerable interest, not merely for the light it sheds on Krishna Menon's absence from the China policy, but how closely Nehru came round to Dutt's point of view. That itself is of some interest. Further, how Dutt wanted to be more cautious than they were after he left. He left in April 1962, 61. And it's after that the slightly more adventurous spirit.
Mr. Dutt left in 61, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm
as
saying.
early as that. He went to Moscow. It's after that that forward policy and so on takes greater prominence, and things like Goa occur, things that Dutt would have deplored. So these changes are related to Dutt's departure. Now, whether that has actually a real bearing upon the 62 war is another matter. But the point is it nuances it considerably, and that is of some value to us, certainly, about the war itself. The other point, which the book has mentioned in more than one place, is that actually the whole thing was decided in Peking to go to war for internal reasons in Peking. So while we have spent all our time discussing what has happened to us and why we did it and where we failed and so on, all that might be beside the point. That is the further point I think that comes out in the book, that they have their own internal reasons for going in for the attack, and those internal reasons are to bolster Mao's position, and therefore he needed a war to do so, and a successful war. Each time there's a radicalization of an internal position, as in 1958, he has another international crisis, as over the Taiwan Straits. Now one more here. So it is, much of it is to do with that. And that one can make out from the fact of the extensive preparation that China made for the war, which that suspected. He says, don't take them at their word. The fact that they do these things indicates that they are getting instructions from Peking. It's not a frontier event. So that was much more realistic, but at the same time very cautious. And that is of some importance.
You know, I think there are two sort of, shall we say, dimensions here. One is the international context, and we'll come back to that about the role played by the non-aligned powers and so on. And Mr. Rana, if I could now turn to you, you were in the service at that time. If you could just help us to understand 1962 in the Indian collective memory, and why is there no official history?
Let's take this from three major things that are left uncovered, which I don't think any book has really got into in depth. Number one, at what stage did we shift from a position that the boundary, India's northern boundary, was not very precise, to a position where it was absolutely clear-cut and was exactly as we said it was? If we go back to the earliest maps, nobody wants to talk about it today, there is in fact, we say it is undefined.
This is the USP of Rajya Sabha TV, so you can speak about it.
Number two is the point that we moved to a forward policy sometime in the late 50s. The origin of the forward policy and the genesis as well as its deployment are only partly known from Mr. Malik's book, but not with clarity. And the third point is the one that deals with many misperceptions and missteps on each side. We just heard that there was a Chinese angle, an internal Chinese angle, and it is a fact. For example, testified by in Kissinger's book China, where we have chapter and verse examples of how China deliberately decided sometime at the end of 61 or thereabouts to hit hard at India. The way it checked, that there might not be any diversionary action or any action from Taiwan, that's a delightful little side story. But coming back to your main question, why is there no official history? I think we are very reluctant to deal with our own past.
So we are
very
trapped
fact
in the way.
that the Henderson Brooks report is not published, we fight shy of setting out a white paper on almost any subject that you could
This
make.
is the right segue to ask Madhavan. You are the editor of the Jawaharlal Nehru selected works. What would you ascribe this to? Is it a cultural issue? Is it a political decision that we have been so diffident about having an official history as far as 1962 is concerned?
We are much too divided on the subject. So nobody can agree as to how it should be written. The point is, when these kinds of official histories are written, everybody wants to have their own paragraph in. This department, that individual, or somebody who sees himself as the legatee of that individual must have it all in. Now, if you make a compilation like that, it will be so contradictory that finally you cannot write anything. And to leave it to an individual scholar to write it all, well, requires enormous strength on the part of a government, self-confidence, and the readiness to override all these bureaucratic and political and ideological lobbies.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Madhavan. It seems, again, I could be mistaken on this. The most credible book on 1962 seems to be the one by Professor Steve Hoffman, which had been, I think, in the early 80s. After that, I do not recall any sort of, shall we say, substantive work. Would that be correct?
I suppose so, yes. And it always happens that it is a foreigner who will write it. Precisely for this reason, they are more independent. And even Amit Dasgupta, who's written this wonderful book on the biography of that Indian, but living in Germany, there's more research possibilities, the research institutions and so on function much better there, and therefore you simply get down to writing these things more effectively there. If you depend upon Government of India and its sources and its way of functioning about these matters, then you end up with a lot of frustration. Need not always be so, but quite a lot of it.
Well, we hope that there would be greater transparency, because the MEA occasionally says that they would make available documents. But Amit, if I can come to you, you made reference to the archives in Yugoslavia, as also Egypt. So can you just give us a small kind of a capsule about the role played by the other non-aligned leaders?
You allow me to give a very short
please.
reply to the two last comments. First, there is a book, of course, and that is War and Peace by Srinath Raghavan, who has investigated the boundary policy. And I think he has answered your first question, that in 1950 there's maps published where the border in the western and the middle sector is declared undefined. And at the end of the year, Nehru in Parliament says our borders are clearly defined by history and custom. So there's the contradiction, and there's no official history, because if there would be an official history, it would throw a very bad light on the government of India. So the war is started by China, and there's endless provocations by China from the mid-50s onwards. There's no doubt about that. But the Indian government has played a very doubtful role over a whole decade in allowing this situation to develop the way it did. The second question about the archives in Egypt and Yugoslavia. So the point is that India was the leading nation among the non-aligned, which had just formed a movement in 1961 in Belgrade. So India, in a manner of speaking, could stand alone by its sheer size and influence, whereas those smaller countries, Egypt and Yugoslavia, needed Nehru in particular in India to allow them an independent role for themselves. So they were very keen that India would not fall with the Western Bloc. You know, the Americans and the British were immediately ready to help, and the Soviets came in a little later, or with the Soviets. So that would have been the end of the non-aligned movement of some relevance. So that's why they tried everything to find a compromise. They didn't do, because the Indonesians, who were also part of the non-aligned movement, they were closely with the Chinese. So there's not really a split in the non-aligned movement, but there are various attempts. But the whole efforts around India allow India to return to a rather non-aligned position, which it hadn't kept around the turn of the year 62, 63.
Ambassador Rana, just to pick this part up, now when we look back, as you rightly said, that both sides had their own perceptions about the other, and a series of what you might call as missteps, resulted in what happened in October 1962. But when we critique Indian diplomacy of that period, you have been a diplomatic author, you have written extensively on this subject. What is it that you think we need to focus on now? What is it the government of India could possibly do, or the Indian Parliament, when we are talking about 1962?
I think we have to ask a basic question. We talk of a settlement. How do we even approach a settlement if we do not begin to prepare public opinion in India for the eventuality of a major change in the shape of the borders? There is a parliament resolution that
Not an inch of territory.
not an inch of territory.
And Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And Supreme Court judgments also in relation to Bangladesh, for example. So how are we going to square those circles? See, at the end of the day, in negotiation, there is a concept of principled negotiation, and there is a concept of negotiation that is based on a positional bargaining. We are in a state of positional bargaining. We would like to shift to principled negotiation, but how to make that transition is a big question mark. Is Indian public opinion, political opinion, ready to really put together a compromise deal? I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Well,
Does the academic have a role here to shape and inform public opinion, or political, shall we say?
it can cut both ways. For example, this is exactly what Subimal Dutt did. He compiled a very extensive piece of research on the subject and brought it out as the official's report, etc., and many other documents. And one of the points made by certain people is that we made our case so strong that the public was convinced that, in fact, we have a cast iron case.
So
we
the
must not
public was
surrender
convinced
anything.
that we had right and might on our side. I mean, that
We
seemed
had
to
right
be-
on our side,
Excuse
which is the
me,
purpose
the
of it.
official's report is seen today really as a piece of creative documentary evidence building. The entire exercise for the officials to meet became futile because there are in fact two reports. There is an Indian report and a Chinese report, and the two have almost nothing in common between them. I don't think Mr. Dutt, if you are going to nail Mr. Dutt's contribution to the official's report on the Indian side, I'm afraid he will be judged very harshly. There is much more to Subimal Dutt than that document, which is really today not credible at all.
Let me bring in Amit, because you have written a book on Mr. Dutt
Yes, it's a
and his
biography,
contribution.
yeah,
Yeah,
just come out, yeah.
So two specific sort of questions, if I may. One is to pick up what Ambassador Rana has said about Mr. Dutt and his own contribution or role at that time, and a larger issue which I think is touched upon in the book. How do Indian diplomats come across to the external interlocutors, whether they were in Moscow or in Belgrade or in Cairo, the others who were also tangentially involved? So would you help us to look at those two?
For understanding Dutt's contribution is a man in the background, so he hardly appears anywhere. He's a very realist, as Professor Palak said, ICS officer coming from the Bajpai school, so to speak. And when he's appointed foreign secretary, the whole tone changes in the external affairs ministry. That talks of the truculent attitude of the Chinese, which is a new tone we hadn't heard before. Before that's always they making friends with China as the best defense policy. So that comes in and says, I want to get an inkling in the Chinese mind. And there's one small dispute, the first dispute ever, that's in UP, Barahoti is a grazing ground.
Yeah.
So that says, let's talk about Barahoti, let's sit with the Chinese. We are ready to lose the territory if they have the better arguments, but we want to see their arguments. So these talks take place after the first incident in 45. The talks take place only in 58, and the Chinese appear with nothing and just obstruct the whole thing. So then that says, okay, we know they don't want to negotiate, might is right. That's their approach. What he does, because he's very much aware that India has no position to fight a war, what he does is going public. And that is, after a while, that is preparing what is finally resulting in the white papers. He is sending Sarvepalli Gopal to the UK archival investigation, and has a sort of a paradoxical effect that Dutt and Nehru both are ready in 59 to give up Aksai Chin, because both believe that India doesn't have a strong stand, which is the bone of content, Aksai Chin. But Sarvepalli Gopal comes back and convinces both the foreign secretary and the prime minister
that they can.
it is ours,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So if he had come to other conclusions, they might have offered a Chu Enlai, which was actually the deal. You mentioned Stephen A. Hoffman, so that's the summit in April 60.
Yeah.
So the Chinese go for the political solution. We keep Aksai Chin, you keep Nepal. and the Indians come for the right solution, the fair solution, that is historical rights, that's what counts.
I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you. A quick one-liner from you. Yeah.
Point on this. You see, it is entirely possible that Nehru himself suggested a solution, which is that even if we say Aksai Chin is ours, we accept, we do not give it up. I mean, that suggested it. We do not give it up, but we do not take any further action. And that is a possible position that could have been held for a longer time without going into rigid.
You'll forgive me in the interest of time. Maybe we'll revisit this after 55 years and look where 1962 is. But at the end of the day, the much touted Asian century will be made or marred by the texture of the relationship between India and China. The last year plus has been testy, and it is hoped that the recent visit of the Indian Foreign Secretary, Dr. Jaishankar, to Beijing, for what has been billed as an upgraded strategic dialogue, will help in managing the differences that have come into the public domain. Globalization impels both countries to remain engaged in the trade and economic sectors, and it is expected that China will soon become the world's most prosperous nation by way of GDP. Around that time, India will be the third largest single state economy after the United States of America. As our discussion highlighted, Asia is trapped in its mix of emotive nationalism and a selectively burnished narrative about having been quote unquote a victim. India, China, Japan, and the two Koreas have their own cross to bear. Can narratives be revisited to make them more malleable to navigate the future? American writer and activist Susan Sontag, the writer, had once observed, and I quote, "Too much remembering embitters. To make peace is to forget. To reconcile, it is necessary that memory be faulty and limited." Unquote. Can India and China review their narratives and encourage fresh academic perspectives? We hope so. On that note, allow me to thank my guests, Dr. Dasgupta, Professor Palak, and Ambassador Rana. And thank you for watching Security Scan. Goodbye.